Chapter 11. The Interflux worm shop was opened without much fanfare on lot 1346B on Monday morning. In lieu of a brass band, Dave Roper played We Shall Overcome on the bassoon as Simon cut the ribbon. Then Dino and Dina took their places as the store's first clerks amidst the applause of about 50 students who had turned out for the official opening. Dave, as the first shift's worm digger, should have been manning his shovel, but since there were no customers, he used this opportunity to explain to disinterested observers how he had constructed the gate in the Interflux fence. The actual worm store itself was unspectacular. It was located on the part of lot 1346B that adjoined the school and consisted of a desk, a tent, and signs. The desk was Mr. Durham's, freely donated since the English teacher had sworn off furniture. It interfered with communication, according to Buzz, and therefore impeded psychic growth. He now convened all his classes, cross-legged on the floor, in a room that was bare to the walls and free of energy flow obstructors. The tent, which bore a sign over the entrance reading "Employees Only," belonged to Dave, and was there for bad weather and to give the employees somewhere to relax at the times of slow business. Simon could not seem to explain to Dave that slow business, if any, was all they could expect, and that he was missing the point entirely in believing this to be the beginning of a worm empire. Dave seemed so upset that no members of the public were there to take advantage of his opening specials that Simon announced that he and his father did a lot of night fishing and that he needed the 5-pack of worms right away. Dino, however, would not hear of this and refused to sell him anything less than a 12-pack, which at $2 was a much better buy than the 5-pack at $1. The 50 spectators were so inspired by the sight of the Interflux boss patronizing the worm shop that they all bought worms too, and soon Dave was out in the field digging up more stock, with several of his friends watching him from a spot designated by a sign as Worm Excavation Scenic Overview. Simon had originally intended to spill his Dixie cup full of worms out in a field somewhere, but Phil forbade this absolutely. "It'll ruin your image if you're seen dumping these worms out. Everyone heard your story about the night fishing. They'll lose confidence in your leadership." "What am I supposed to do?" Simon retorted. "Keep them?" "Yes! None of these other people need worms any more than you do, and they're not throwing them away. It's kind of like the unwritten law. Your problem is you know nothing about psychology. Throw away those worms and Interflux is a charity case. But if you keep them, we've got a winning proposition here. Just put them in your locker or something. Then, if you're so keen on born free, you can throw them in your garden when you get home. Even a worm needs a change of scenery now and then." By this time, it was 11:30, and Simon and Phil decided that class was no longer an alternative and that they would take a long lunch period. The worm store had already made $80, which was more than Simon had figured to pull in over the store's entire lifespan. "We should tell Sam about this," said Simon. "He'll get a real kick out of it." "I wouldn't be too sure of that," Phil replied skeptically. "You see, Sam's a boyfriend now." "Huh? A boyfriend. It happened this weekend, around the same time as Barbara became a girlfriend. That's the way it works. They come in pairs." Yeah, but what's that got to do with him wanting to hear about the $80? "Oh, boyfriends never concern themselves with matters as trivial as worm stores. All their brain cells are taken up with thinking about the people they're boyfriends of. It's the same with girlfriends, only their brain cells are all taken up with making sure the boyfriend's brain cells are all taken up with the girlfriend's." Simon laughed. "Oh, come on, Phil. Don't tell me you're jealous. It's not jealousy, it's aggravation. Dig this. One date goes well, and Barbara, the timid little kid who can only worship from afar, gets cocky. Do you know what she did? She insulted the rack. And what did Sam say? He said, "Yeah, I know. Phil and I have been talking about getting a new one for a long time. Give me a break!" "Well, you've got to figure that he's trying to make a good impression," said Simon, who could have easily pictured himself bending the truth into a pretzel over Wendy had he not established himself in her heart as public enemy number one. He just wants the relationship to work out. "Big deal! This is the rack we're talking about! The most beautiful, wonderful 68 Volkswagen ever to rust, rattle, and heave! He should have told her, listen, Carrot Top, this is a great car, and if you want to be driving around in a limo, well, that's too bad. Let me tell you, this is a textbook case of boyfriend syndrome. Simon was sure that Phil was overreacting. But during lunch, he noticed the tendency in Sam to use this expression, Barbara says, with alarming frequency. Barbara's a big fan of the Rolling Stones, Sam was saying. Think I'm gonna go home and melt all my records, Phil muttered under his breath. Aloud, he said pleasantly, where is the little woman? Oh, she's in a rehearsal that's running a little late. She should be by any minute. The big news buzzing around the cafeteria was, of course, the opening of the Worm store, although not much was said about it under the camel, since Barbara felt worms weren't fitting table conversation. But fitting or not, weeds were out and worms were in, and Nassau Arts was in a festive mood. Shortly after noon, Dino and Dina came back from their shift and reported that business was picking up again as students on lunch hour ventured out to see the store firsthand. Dave Roper, who was still out there even though he'd been replaced, refused to leave, predicting a big run on the worms over the 2 main lunch period and therefore a need for additional staff. Everyone was buying worms, though for what reason Simon couldn't imagine. Maybe they, like Dave, had lost sight of the real purpose of the exercise and wanted to see the store become a success. Or perhaps they had somehow decided that each worm purchase was a nail in Interflux's coffin. One way or another, the worms were going like hotcakes, and the students were apparently obeying Phil's unwritten law for by the later periods of the day, the Nassau Arts halls were crawling with escaped worms. Whoever had designed the lockers hadn't anticipated worm storage, for there were large air holes close to the floor. These were perfect tickets to freedom for the aggressive November worm, and soon the janitorial staff was up in arms over the unfavorable turn the job had taken. An urgent communique was dispatched to the head of the Custodians Union, Local 237, but ironically he was away on a fishing trip and no doubt had his own worms to worry about. After school, Sam commandeered the wreck to give Barbara a ride home, so Simon and Phil went out to check on the progress of the Interflux worm shop. It was mobbed. Students who hadn't had a chance to get out to the store between classes now lined up to participate in the phenomenon. Bill McIntosh was one of these, commenting, if I'm going to sit all day in a school filled with creepy crawlies, I'm at least going to have the pleasure of contributing to the problem. Simon was almost afraid to open up his locker again, but his 12 turned out to be the only worms docile enough to stay put. This was largely because 11 of them had died. Simon was almost owner incompetence, commented Phil darkly. He confiscated the sole survivor, named him Keith, and took him under his wing. The rest received a burial at sea in the nearby washroom. After dinner, Simon and Phil returned to the worm store to supervise the 7 o'clock closing. Dave Roper was still there, gray with fatigue, having skipped an entire day of classes. Simon reacted half with amusement and half with horror when Dave informed him that the day's take totaled $946. In all that business, only one customer had been a non-student. 102-year-old Jedediah Odell, the self-proclaimed oldest man on Long Island, fished every day year-round and was delighted to find reasonably priced November bait. The $946, most of it in ones, was crammed into a bulging shoebox and presented to Simon. I'm gonna be a real hit at the bank tomorrow, he told Phil as they climbed into the Firebird. I suppose I should bring that other $60 worth of change from tax day with me too. That way they'll think I held up a candy store. If you bet that money like I told you, we'd be swimming in dough. We gotta fix up the wreck, put in bucket seats, maybe even a tape deck, so that her royal red-headed majesty could listen to the Rolling Stones while complaining about the car. Man, this is a strange world. You think you know a guy and zap, he turns into a boyfriend. Bing, the end. Give him some time, said Simon soothingly. That night, Simon was invited over to the Baldwins to witness the birth of Phil's first project for innovative arts, and was shocked to find that the materials consisted of a large art board, a high-speed electric fan, yellow, red, and blue dye, and a peeled banana on a bent coat hanger. What are you going to do with all this stuff? I'm gonna dip the banana in each of the colors 10 times, Phil said evenly. Then, before it has a chance to drip, I'm going to feed it through the fan, which will spray it onto the board. Then I'll wait for it to harden, throw a few coats of shellac over it so it doesn't rot and stink out the world. He paused thoughtfully. It should look pretty good. Or not. It's the creation that's important. Simon goggled. Look, Phil, I don't know much about innovative arts, but don't you think you better do something a little more, normal? No. Normal is what you guys do in Karada's class. Mr. Koperdrick says that anyone can slop paint on a canvas and make it look like something. But it takes a real innovative artist to shoot it from across the room out of an air rifle and have it look like nothing. But at least that's paint. This is a banana! Well, Phil said as he flicked the switch to start the fan, we can't very well knock it until we tried it, right? Phil came very close to being thrown out of the house that evening. Mrs. Baldwin said her basement would never be the same again, and Simon was inclined to agree. I guess when they designed these electric fans, Phil commented, they weren't really thinking about getting bananas to splatter back onto an artboard. It's got a pretty wide spray. Maybe I should have used the Cuisinart. Look at my basement! Howled Mrs. Baldwin for the 30th time. Philip, how could you? There's banana on my walls, the floor, the ceiling, TC's room! He isn't coming back till January, Phil said irritably. There's plenty of time to clean it up. We'll have mice and rats, and monkeys, Phil added helpfully. Simon wiped some of the multicolored banana slime from his pants. Did any of it get on the artboard? Oh, plenty, said Phil. You know, I've got a real respect for the banana after this. It's a miracle of packaging. He motioned around the room where colored slop was oozing down the walls and furniture. All that came from one little yellow tube thing. It's a remarkable fruit. Philip Lester Baldwin, will you quit talking nonsense and help me clean this mess up? Afterward, with the room cleaned up but still smelling strongly of banana, and Mrs. Baldwin claiming her son had definitely not heard the last of this, Phil put the finishing coat of shellac on the work of art. It's terrible, said Simon honestly. Yeah, I know, kind of gross too, but innovative, that's what counts. As the week progressed, business dropped to practically zero at the Interflux worm shop as patronage was reduced to the handful of students who had missed the big opening and loyal customer Jedediah Odell. Odell, who went through 24 worms a day, expressed concern over the store's future with the decline in business. The staff absorbed this new situation with no loss of dedication, and since Simon had no assigned hours, he was beginning to get the feeling that he had virtually no connection at all with this worm store. Dave Roper was definitely in charge. Distraught over the drop in revenues, Dave ordered an enormous batch of signs. These he directed to be set up all over town, even along the Long Island Expressway route. Interflux, however, was right on top of the situation and had the towns confiscating these signs as illegal advertising. The first Simon heard of all this was when the notice of the fine arrived. It was the happiest he'd seen Wendy since she'd be convinced that there were going to be parties and socials galore at Nassau Arts. $150 down the pike, Phil exclaimed. Do you know what the loss of $150 is like from a guy who goes broke Tuesdays and alternate Thursdays? It's like really bad. Dave was unconcerned and began nagging Simon to take out TV and newspaper ads. The worm problem in the school halls was very well on its way to solving itself, as the life expectancy of a worm, even the wily November variety, was tragically short in a crowded building. This pleased the janitors, and Local 237 calmed down. Phil's worm, Keith, was one of the lucky ones, living to squirm again in the Baldwin's geranium bed. On Tuesday night, T.C. Surratt moved lock, stock, and barrel into the Irving household to take up a 48-hour residence. Simon made a point of warning his new house guest about Cyril Irving's position in Interflux. He had been secretly scared stiff that the agent would come across an Interflux official paper, or Mr. Irving's Interflux briefcase, or notice Mr. Irving's Interflux ring and freak out. But TC took the news in stride, his professional calm back to normal after the incident with Karada. Oh, I knew that, Sam. As soon as I saw your father's name in the paper, I figured out who you were. Simon was taken aback. You mean you knew all this time and you didn't say anything? Didn't you think it was kind of weird? T.C. shrugged. It was none of my business. Although the Irvings were a little taken aback by the amount of baggage their house guests had brought, they took T.C. immediately. Mrs. Irving found him charming, and Mr. Irving was won over after Simon explained to him that T.C. was not an Interflux agent. It never came up that he was Interflux's agent, and this was in fact the sole reason for his stay. Best of all, Mrs. Irving cooked special dinners, including steak. Why does he have to leave so soon? Mr. Irving ended up saying when the 2 days were over. I was getting used to the nourishment. Besides, that's a fine boy. Sharp, serious, knowledgeable about business. He's wasting his time at Nassau Arts. He looks like an excellent candidate for Abercrombie Prep. On Thursday, Simon was surprised when Barbara came rushing up to him. Simon, I've just got to talk to you. What about? Simon asked wearily. He had no desire to play Ann Landers again. Let's go somewhere we can talk. Furtively, she led him down to a deserted stairwell. Look, Barbara, if this is about Sam, I don't think... Shh! It's not about Sam, it's about Wendy. Well, this was it, Simon decided. Wendy had a gun, and this was his fair warning to get out of the country. Aloud, he said noncommittally, Yeah? She's crazy about you. Wendy or... Of course! No, Simon explained. Wendy hates my guts. Oh, that's all an act. Oh, sure, she was mad at you at first, but that's all changed. She secretly admires you for all the stuff you've been doing, but she's afraid she blew her chance when she beat you up, so she pretends she's still mad. But she never stops talking about you. Take it from me, she definitely likes you. I see. Now, all you have to do is be aggressive. If you're straightforward and forceful, she'll forget her act completely. Simon examined his fingernails critically. What makes you think I'm interested? Barbara looked motherly. Because Sam told me that you're really nuts about her. Simon found Phil on duty sitting at Mr. Durham's old desk at the worm store. Everything you said about Sam's stubbornness goes double. What a boyfriend! In a rage, he summarized his meeting with Barbara. Phil seemed pleased. Congratulations, Wendy likes you. That's what you wanted, right? It's obviously a joke. They want me to ask her out so she can make me look like a complete idiot. Phil shook his head. Don't you see? It can't be a joke. This is Barbara. She hasn't got the... to make a joke. That stupid next-door neighbor of yours, Simon seethed, he has a mouth on him like the Grand Canyon. He told my personal business, communicated in confidence to Barbara. Why didn't he just take on ad in the Sun? Phil shook his head. It's just another symptom of boyfriend syndrome, and if I were you, I wouldn't say too much about this, considering you could be fighting off the effects of the same thing pretty soon, what with Wendy liking you and all. There's nothing more to that than carefully calculated cruelty. I don't know, Phil said speculatively, but it's just bizarre enough for me to believe it. You and Wendy. Sometime in the afternoon, the duty roster went up for the next week of the Interflux Worm Shop. By the time Simon saw it, it was completely filled up with the names of volunteers. Simon could see the name Dave Roper liberally sprinkled all across the board Monday through Friday. But there were a few surprises, too. Bill McIntosh and Dino appeared repeatedly on the sheet. They were in the midst of a $250,000 Interflux Worm Shop Invitational Crazy Eights tournament, which Dino presently led 48 games to 46. The second week promised even more strategy, action, and tantrums. Not that much Crazy Eight was played at the end of the first week, however, for business suddenly began to pick up. Junior and middle school students who had heard about the store through their older brothers and sisters began to flock out to the Interflux land to see what the big deal was about. With them, they brought a swarm of parents, some of whom were even more interested than their children to see Interflux in operation. So once again, the Interflux Worm Shop was moving stock at capacity to droves of customers, none of whom had any use for worms. By closing Friday, Interflux had over $1,500. Simon spent the weekend working on a new painting, but his mind kept wandering to what Barbara had told him about Wendy, to Sam and his boyfriend syndrome, and to the fact that he had not been picked to venture out to Greenwich, Connecticut with a Nathan Krutman film crew. Phil, Dino, and Dina were among those chosen to act in the establishment of Earth's first space station on Pluto. Rumor had it that the quarter-ton couple was going to perform a spectacular weightlessness scene. Simon decided privately that if Nathan Krutman actually did come up with a role for him, which wasn't very likely, he would tell him to stuff it. On its worst day, Interflux was every bit as important as Nathan's stupid movie, and Simon Irving was not a man to be taken lightly. At home, the pressure was off Simon because the flake had made headlines again. After a rather long night, which, according to reports, had lasted over a week, Kyle Montrose had been found skinny dipping in the reflecting pools of the Taj Mahal. On top of this, The Sun published an article entitled "Exciting Green Vegetables and Big Salads Were Now a Cause for Alarm." These two developments had Mr. Irving too wrapped up in his own problems to cause any discomfort for Simon. On Monday, a new dimension hit the worm shop. Word of mouth had spread around Long Island to such an extent that the Sun sent a reporter and photographer over to take pictures of the operation and get the Interflux story. The interview was handled by Phil, but Dave Roper could not be restrained from getting his 2 cents here and there, and several other students who happened to be on the scene were questioned briefly. Simon avoided the whole exercise for fear that his name might connect him with his father, although it was let slip that somewhere in the background was a student silently masterminding the Interflux game plan. The article, complete with pictures, appeared in the next morning's edition under the headline, "Students Worm Their Way Out from Under Interflux Boot." Cyril Irving expected the worst. He knew from experience that Interflux versus the little guy was a favorite football for the national press to throw around. He was not surprised when the New York papers picked up the story the very next day, and he knew the wire services would not be far behind. The dilemma was discussed and rediscussed at length over the Interflux boardroom until finally Mr. Hardy spoke. Although he was only a junior lawyer, all the men in the room gave him their absolute undivided attention, for he had drawn the shortest straw out in the hall before the meeting. It was therefore his responsibility to put to Cyril Irving the question that was on everyone's mind. "Look, Cyril, aren't we ignoring a much simpler solution? Everyone here knows the head of Interflux is your son, Simon. I mean, it really seems like we're going through an awful lot of trouble when you could just, tell him to stop." "I can't do that," Mr. Irving said shortly. "My son is working with school money, and he can't sell me the land without the approval of 1,500 kids who won't give it." There was a babble of protest, and everyone looked at poor Mr. Hardy, indicating that it was time for him to further the argument. "But Cyril, Simon's a real big shot at that school. The kids all think he's a genius and would follow him anywhere. I'm sure he can convince him, but first you have to convince him." Mr. Irving looked out over the table icily. "Do you mean to tell me that with all of our resources, our experience, our wealth and power, and our overpaid executives, that the only way out of this is for me to bully my son? Are you saying that if Simon weren't my son, we'd have to pack up our plant and move elsewhere? That's a little silly, isn't it?" He stood up. "December 7th is the key day. We must initiate full construction by then. You people have my word that the date will never be in jeopardy. If the papers want to print David and Goliath stories, let them. They know we haven't used real muscle yet." He paused. "But I ask, no, I insist that you remember this. Simon Irving is a coincidence in this affair and nothing more. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mayor Van Doren is in my office."